Hello everyone, I'm here with Neil Hamilton, the leader of UKIP Wales and the man that most people know as the Red Dragon. How are you doing, Neil?
I'm all right. A Ddraig Goch, the Red Dragon in Welsh.
There we go. So let's talk about your social media presence and the YouTubers who have joined UKIP. How do you feel about people like myself, Cam Dankula, Paul Joseph Watson, Milo joining UKIP?
I think this is a massively good thing for UKIP. You know, when I first joined UKIP in 2002, the average age of members, was 72. So UKIP is great for longevity, but we do need to get younger people involved. And you know, when I first got involved in politics back in the 1960s, I was an idealist. Young people are idealists. I think that what UKIP offers most of all is idealism in politics, against the other establishment parties who are full of careerists and opportunists, and they've lost their way. You know, we can turn the world on its head, and that's what I'm trying to do.
Well, you're certainly doing that on social media, and I have to say I'm rather a fan, and I think you've got many new fans as well. So I suppose we should really talk about what the Conservatives are doing with Brexit. We're currently in the middle of, I don't know, I would call it a catastrophe. But I mean, how do you feel about the current resignations in the Conservative Party? Well,
they're a very good thing, and not before time. You know, David Davis actually should have resigned a long time ago. It's perfectly clear. The writing's been on the wall almost since the beginning. Theresa May is a Remainer, and although she didn't have the balls in the referendum campaign actually to take an active part, she is a fully paid up member of the do-nothing establishment, and the cabinet is dominated by Remainers. They were always going to sabotage the process, and I think he should have realised that earlier on. But having said that, you know, full marks to him for having had the sense of principle to resign now. And I gather that Boris Johnson has resigned also in the last hour or so. So
yes,
so the tectonic plates may be moving.
Indeed, it's a bit breaking news. So I'm afraid we don't have any particular information on that as we're recording this. Yeah. So Dominic Raab, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. How do you feel about him stepping up to take Davis's place?
Well, I can't understand how any self-respecting Brexiteer would allow himself to be put in that position. It's quite clear that he's just a stooge, a frontman. He will never be allowed to direct the process. The reason that Davis has resigned is because he was marginalised.
Indeed.
So anybody coming in at this point is going to be even more marginalised.
Yeah.
So what's the point? You know, he fills a chair. Is that all he wants to be remembered for in life?
Well, I mean, that's a genuine concern, isn't it? And especially with the terms and conditions that Theresa May is herself proposing. I mean, it seems that Jacob Rees-Mogg's prediction of vassalage to the European Union has actually been fulfilled in these terms. And yet, hasn't Barnier already dismissed them?
Yeah, well, this is the negotiating tactic of the EU. The negotiating tactic is they're not negotiating, of course.
Yes.
But they will say no to everything so that you keep on offering more and more and more and more. Until eventually you get nothing in return and nothing much has changed. We're still in the EU. That's what they want.
And that was Davis's entire contention, wasn't it? She's giving away far too much too easily.
Yeah.
And I agree. I think she should be playing much harder ball with this. Yeah. So, I mean, how do you think that the negotiations should have gone from the British perspective going into Brexit?
Well, we should never have accepted the EU policy of sequencing to start with. That is, you know, they wouldn't even talk about trade until we'd told them how much money we were going to pay for the privilege of trading with them, and what was going to happen with the Irish border, etc., etc. We should never have allowed that to be a game changer right from the beginning. And you know, Yanis Varoufakis, the Greek finance minister, wrote a book about this called The Adults in the Room, where he set out all the negotiating tactics that the EU would use because he'd been through them as the Greek finance minister 5 or 6 years ago. So we didn't need to look in the crystal, it was all there in the book. But still the government paid no attention to that. We should have said to them, you know, here's the deal, we have a proper negotiation, bona fide negotiation, where yes, we may end up compromising on some things, but fundamentally we are leaving the EU, we're going to be a self-governing country, we're not going to be subject to the decisions of the European Court, we're not going to take rules from Brussels made by an unelected commission, the British Parliament is going to be sovereign. Either you're prepared to deal with us on that basis, or else there's no point in talking. Thank you and goodbye.
Well, this is actually what I've been saying from the start. I mean, like you say, agreeing to EU procedure going into negotiation is effectively agreeing to anything the EU is going to demand. Yeah. Because on what grounds will you say, I refuse, because they will say, oh, well, up until this point you agreed with everything we said, why won't we go further? And I mean, you're going to have to try and undo all of the previous agreements you've had. And it's ridiculous. And we're going into it essentially giving the EU the whip hand, when they're the ones who are demanding, what was it, £40 billion from us? And, and I mean, why on earth I mean, it can't just be that Theresa May is a Remainer, can it? It must be some sort of character weakness of May's that she's allowed this to go on. I mean,
yeah, well, you see, these people are historic pessimists, I think, and defeatists.
Yes.
They don't believe that Britain can be a successful nation in its own right.
Yes.
This is the trouble, these people. A lot of them have spent their lives in the public sector in some shape or form. They don't have entrepreneurial instincts. They don't believe that they can change the world. Indeed, Theresa May thinks the world is not capable of being changed by anybody. She's a product of inertia, in my opinion. So, of course, she was quite the wrong person to direct this process. This is a great adventure. This is like Christopher Columbus getting into a ship, sailing off out to the far west, not knowing whether he was going to drop off the end of the world or not. But as a result of which, he changed his world. We have to have that kind of self-belief as a nation if we're going to make a success of this. And having a collection of deadbeats like the time wasters and time servers in Theresa May's cabinet means that you can never even start out on that journey. They never get beyond the sluice gates of the port.
I completely agree. That's a fantastic way of characterising it, because it's bizarre that a nation with such an open and entrepreneurial spirit should find itself effectively cowering before the Continentals. And I find this baffling. And I just can't help but think 200 years ago, 100 years ago, what would the opinion have been? I mean, I can't help but think there would have been, Englishmen in Parliament raging about the idea of us conceding a damn thing to the Europeans.
And Welshmen too.
Oh, of course, sorry. I do apologise, But Britishmen, just the idea that we're just going to agree to what is effectively sort of German procedure and allow ourselves to be slowly eked out into what will become a vassal province. I mean, the fact that we've got no trade leverage with the EU under Theresa May's plans is the worst possible outcome. It's worse than having no deal, isn't it?
Right, because they've institutionalised a trade surplus for themselves in this as well. We had a deficit last year with the European Union of £190 billion in goods. Right? We have a surplus in financial services, but financial services is not part of the single market. So, they win hands down because they've dictated the terms of the deal.
Yes.
Germany exports 750,000 cars to us every year. 17%, 1 in 6 of every vehicle that's produced in Germany is exported to Britain. Now, is that not an enormous weapon in our hands, or should be, in a negotiation?
I completely agree, and this is what Donald Trump was saying, wasn't it? He saw how Theresa May was approaching this and said, well, that's not how I would do it, and that's because Donald Trump is, frankly, a savvy negotiator in many ways. Regardless of the character faults of the man himself, you can't deny his successes, and he's absolutely right to be pushing the boundaries when they need to be pushed. I mean, I actually rather like his negotiating tactic of demanding it all and then conceding on those things that you don't actually want. So the opponent that you're negotiating with feels like they've gained, and you've also gained your ground. And I mean, Theresa May just seems to be rolling over.
Well, the first thing they should have done is to order a few hundred copies of Donald Trump's The Art of the Deal.
Yes, they should, yes.
And they should have read it and absorbed it and inwardly digested it and then used it as a negotiating strategy for this EU negotiation. But, we mustn't perhaps get hung up on the negotiations, because we're talking different languages, because we are talking in terms of the economic well-being of not just our people but also the people of Europe. Free trade obviously means free exchange of goods and maximises wealth. The EU is a protectionist racket run by multinational corporations and international bureaucrats, and by politicians on the gravy train who are merely trying to preserve their own privileges. And so what for them is the overriding objective is to complete the political project of a federal Europe. So for them, the overriding need is to stop anybody else following Britain and leaving the EU. So this is what Project Fear is all about, and the EU negotiations, and Dr. No, Monsieur Barnier, is quite self-consciously, I think, presenting himself as the most intransigent person in the room in order to frighten everybody else from adopting the same course of freedom that Britain was able to do with the referendum campaign. So you're never going to be able to do a deal with these people because there's nothing you can give them that they want, and therefore there's no reason that they should compromise.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, any compromise to the European Union is effectively a loss in the long term, because exactly like you say, I mean, they must make an example of us.
Yeah.
And for some reason, Theresa May is willing to be made an example of.
Yeah.
And I mean, how stable do you find Europe at this point? How stable do you find the European project?
Well, there's steam coming out of every orifice, isn't there?
Yes, there is.
In Italy, in Poland, in Germany even.
Yep, and Hungary.
I hope that the Alternative for Deutschland is going to have a great success in the elections in September. You know, the people are rising in revolt everywhere because the straitjacket which has been imposed upon them and tightened regularly over the last 60 years is now getting too tight, and people are trying to break out of it. And I hope that, as William Pitt said during the Napoleonic Wars, that England has saved herself by exertions and will, as I trust, save Europe by her example. That's the attitude that we want in these negotiations with the EU.
I completely agree. I mean, this is... If Britain, what was it, the ex-French Prime Minister said that Britain had a responsibility not to destroy the European Union as she exited. And I think that is one of the most realistic assessments of what's happening here. Because I think that if we got a sort of swashbuckling Brexiteer in office who was prepared to use the nuclear option, say no deal if we don't get what we want, or if we don't get a fair deal. And that's not to say that we have to be unfair to the Europeans, but I think that the requirement that they have from us is greater than what we have from them, considering the instability of their political project. And so I just can't understand why the left, I mean, where is Jeremy Corbyn on all of this? He's been completely hounded by Momentum, who for some reason want to stay. And like you said, it's a giant protectionist neoliberal racket. It's a good thing that Jeremy Corbyn would want to leave from a socialist perspective.
Well, I voted with Jeremy Corbyn times without number in the division lobbies in the House of Commons in the 80s and 90s against the centralisation and federalising of the European Union. He was a good Eurosceptic, and I believe still is underneath it all.
I agree.
If you look at on YouTube at some of the most impressive, eloquent and inspiring philippics against the federalising agenda of the EU bureaucrats, who are the people who you'll be watching? You'll be watching Tony Benn, Dennis Skinner, Peter Shaw, and people who come from what now would be regarded as the far left. Although Tony Benn fitted into a rather different historical tradition, going back to the Civil War and the Levellers and the Ranters and the Puritans. But I can't understand why the left see this massive bureaucratic project, which, as an act of policy, freezes out democratic voices. The EU was the 1940s answer to a 1930s problem. Monnet and the people who designed the EU saw democracy as a problem. And in the 1930s, plebiscites had confirmed Hitler and Mussolini in power, and so they saw the inevitable Second World War as being caused by democracy, because the people are too stupid to see where their long-term well-being is to be found, and therefore you have to have high-minded civil servants, much like Monnet and Schuman themselves, surprisingly, who knew what was best for people, and they had to be institutionalised in the framework. That's why the European Commission is vested with the sole lawmaking power in the EU.
Yes, I actually went to the anti-Brexit protests a few weeks ago, and I was interviewing just, regular people on the street, and they couldn't understand that the MEPs don't have the same power as they do in this country. They just had no idea. And when I was trying to explain to them, some of them outright flatly denied what I was saying. And I just say, look, you get your phone out, go to their website. The Commission admits on their website they are the sole legislative body of the European Union. How can you, and you don't elect those people, so how can you ever say that it's a democratic or accountable body?
Yeah, of course. And even the European Parliament can never be a democratic and accountable body, because obviously there are 27, 28 different countries in the EU, all of which have different historical traditions. Absolutely. They have national elections at different times. There's a shifting cast of politicians who are wafting through the the halls of power in Brussels. I mean, I was bizarrely myself a member of the EU Council of Ministers for 2.5 years in the 1990s, and I was the UK representative on internal market issues. And so I've seen this operating from the inside. Of course, all their meetings are in secret, and there's no way in which this institution could ever be made accountable to anybody in Europe. So the project itself ultimately is doomed to fail because of its own internal contradictions, which were devised from the start to avoid the democratic process, and that's not sustainable in the longer term, in my view.
I completely agree, and I've recently been reading Čapek, I believe it is, the Czech author, who I read his letters.
Catastrophe.
That's it. Sorry, yeah. I only see these words written down. I never hear them spoken, so I never know how to pronounce them. But he was very interested in the difference of character between Britain and the continent. And after reading Letters from England, I can very much see there's a publication called the New European, and they suggested that Brexit was basically British and specifically English, but I think that's an unfair characterization. Sort of British exceptionalism, and it's to do with the character of the people and the concern of accountability that the British have always had towards their superiors. What do you think about that? It's just cultural clash, effectively.
Well, there is definitely a cultural difference. We are an island people, to start with.
Yes.
So, of course, that insularity, physical insularity, inevitably creates a feeling of difference and independence. On the continent of Europe, borders are rarely natural, and armies have marched across these lines on the map many, many times, and so national cohesion is made much more difficult in those circumstances. And once you've been used to being invaded regularly, it does rather tend to change your outlook on the world. And so, you know, what is the European Union? It's a collection of peoples all fleeing from their past. You know, the French are afraid of the Germans are afraid of themselves. The Spain was a dictatorship until recently. Italy, Italy was not created as a nation until the 1860s, and still there's a difference between the north and the south, and internal pressures are tearing often countries which are nations apart. We've seen nations torn apart, like Yugoslavia, in our lifetime. You know, all Eastern European countries are in flight from their past, dominated by the Soviet Union. And so Britain didn't have that legacy, and so we, of course, went into the European Union, or Common Market, as we then called it, in a period of national pessimism and decline, and we thought that osmosis was going to make us as economically successful as Germany. It didn't quite work out like that, but although Thatcher did reverse the trend of economic decline from the 1980s onwards. But we, I think, have now discovered or rediscovered our national self-confidence, and the only people who are now letting us down are our own governments. You know, the government have failed the people. We should get rid of the government, but the government has a different attitude. You know, it's the people who failed us, therefore we must get rid of the people, have another referendum, and that's what this fight is all about. It's a revolt of the people against the elites, and we must never cease to focus on that, I think.
I completely agree, and that brings us on to, I suppose, what I will describe as the Remainer press. But I find that there are very few national newspapers that are what I would call swashbuckling Brexiteers, and I find that very disappointing because it's expected that the press would hold the government to account and therefore be the representatives of the people, at least in ethos, if not, you know, necessarily in name. But why are they basically all opposed to Brexit? What I mean, the amount of sort of morale-lowering pieces that I see pumped out of not only the left-wing press but also some of the right-wing outlets on a daily basis is remarkably disheartening, considering more than half of the country is pro-Brexit. Why do you think this is?
I'm at a loss to understand it, really. I mean, all right, the Associated Newspapers, which owns the Mail, is owned by the Rothermeres, and Lord Rothermere lives in Paris. So maybe that explains that, I don't know. But, you know, they've now in the process of getting rid of Paul Dacre, and Geordie Gregg, who's going to be the new Supremo, is a massive Old Etonian Remainer, school chum of Cameron, all the rest of it. You know, all these people in the establishment, media establishment as much as the business establishment, think that they're better than their customers, and in the case of the media, their readers. The BBC is a massive taxpayer-dominated racket, taxpayer-funded racket,
Yes.
which is an outhouse for The Guardian, fundamentally.
Absolutely.
So all these people permeate the media establishment, and they're totally opposed to what ordinary people want. Their lead lives, they're totally foreign to the lives of ordinary people, and they despise them. They really have contempt for ordinary people.
They absolutely do, and you can tell that in the way they use the term populism.
Yeah.
I mean, what is a democracy if not popular sovereignty?
Yeah.
And so to make the accusation you're a populist,
Yeah.
yes, I'm a Democrat.
I remember when Kelvin Mackenzie was the editor of The Sun, and people used to, in contemptuous, sneering, lip-curling terms, refer to The Sun as a popular newspaper, or the popular press. He said, yeah, well, that's much better than part of the unpopular press, isn't it? and that's the attitude I think that we should rebut that
Yes.
kind of accusation with. And so what I've been doing all my political life, actually, is swimming against the tide of conventional power politics, even though I've been ostensibly and superficially part of the process, being a member of Parliament and as government minister and so on. But nevertheless, I've always set myself against this kind of top-down, sneering approach to the people and their feelings. Ultimately, we should be a working democracy in this country. And the reason why I'm a libertarian in economics as well is because capitalism is a democratic and liberating process. Freedom is the pabulum which creates everything else in life that's good. And yes, there is a role for government at the edges, but fundamentally, if we want to live in a free society and be able to express ourselves and develop to fulfill our own individual goals, it's not going to be with bossy top-down nanny state government in charge. That's what we've got to get rid of.
Yes.
And so all my life I've set myself to plant explosives all around the system, and then where I can apply the detonators and blow the whole thing up. So.
Oh, I think that's a wonderful way of describing it as well, and it very much speaks to my position as the alternative media. And myself, Cam Dankula, Paul Joseph Watson, we're all. It's actually really amazing. It's rather hard to find large alternative media outlets that are genuinely pro-EU. Most of them are pragmatically pro-EU. They say, well, it'll cost us money, but when you interrogate them on the ideas, they will agree in principle. Of course we should be sovereign. Of course the people should be the ones who are essentially steering the ship, and the politicians as the representatives of them doing their bidding, And so it's actually, I mean, I feel like I have a lot of moral authority when it comes to this kind of thing, because I'm very much interested in making sure that power is focused on what the voters want, because ultimately it is the voters who hold the power, as they learned with the referendum. Now they're stuck with a decision that they absolutely loathe, because they've, like you say, divorced themselves from the regular person. And the contempt is outrageous. But do you think that our odds of actually getting the Brexit we want are at any? I mean, I assume that what will happen is we'll get the Brexit we don't want, and then in 5 years' time, or however long it'll be, the new election cycle will come around, and we'll have to essentially campaign on that platform.
Well, it's clear that in legal terms we will leave the EU, but what we'll end up then is worse than what we've got now, because we will be effectively inside the EU but with no voice, and or at least a voice that can be ignored. We won't have any votes, we won't be able to influence decisions because we won't be at the table. So to an extent, those who wanted the Norway option had more sense than Theresa May and her followers. The Tories have achieved the impossible. They've got the worst of all worlds. and they risk now civil war in their own party. Not that I'm bothered about that. Bring it on, I say. I'm very happy to contribute towards it, and certainly to benefit from it as a party, my own party of UKIP. And anybody who is a lapsed member of UKIP ought now to rejoin, and anybody who believes the same kinds of things that we do ought now to join, because all that these people understand ultimately in the political establishment is the power of the ballot box. Losing their jobs, that's the key thing. And so when they were frightened of UKIP 5 years ago, we managed to prize a referendum out of them, which they'd set their faces against having for the whole of the previous 40 years. And we got the referendum. Then they thought they could frighten us out of voting to leave. Project Fear, which is still going on today.
Of course
and that didn't work either. So then the establishment decided they would subvert the Brexit negotiating process, which they have successfully done. But we will keep on going.
Yes.
This is an unstoppable train that has been let out of the station, and we will keep on going until we do get what we want. I hope I shall live long enough to see it. It's a further incentive to me to keep going as well. But this is not going to work, and it's a half-baked non-solution to the issue. So the Tories will have to face up to the fact that they've failed. And we saw this with the Major government. I lived through 5 years in the 1990s of John Major as Prime Minister, creating an unnecessary civil war in the Tory party on Europe over the Maastricht Treaty. And they were wiped out in 1997. We may have to go through the same process again. A lot of people think that this will be more unpalatable because that would make Jeremy Corbyn Prime Minister. I couldn't care less, to be honest, because governments are temporary in a democratic system, unlike in the EU, where the government is permanent. We can't elect it and we can't dismiss it. So whatever the short-term disadvantages that come about from the collapse of the Conservative Party, the long-term gain is what we should be looking for.
Yeah, I think that people forget that, 5 years of Jeremy Corbyn is an unpalatable prospect. But on the plus side, I think it will galvanise the electorate to understand that we really have to be looking at this. And I don't like using this term, but from a British perspective, rather than a sort of socialist perspective or a corporatist perspective like the Conservatives. We have to be looking at it for the actual nation itself. And what do we want? And I think that sovereignty and independence and freedom really are ideas that they've been eroded, and we really have to start retaking this ground.
But nations are a reality.
Yes.
Because a nation is a nation when it feels itself to be a nation.
Yes.
It's not something you can create artificially.
Yes.
This is the problem with the EU. They're trying to create a new country called Europe.
Yes.
And this is something which is created artificially and therefore can never succeed. We should never be frightened of extolling the virtues of nationhood, because that is the natural a preconception of human beings, is to group together with like-minded people with the same sort of history and outlook on the world. Of course, in Wales, there are a lot of people who think that Wales is a separate nation and they don't want to be British. And yes, I can understand that. What I don't understand about the Welsh nationalists, Plaid Cymru here, is that they're quite, they don't want to be governed from Westminster by people that we elect, but they're quite happy to be governed by people they can't even name in Brussels, and when they don't elect, can't dismiss. So it's a very bizarre kind of nationalism that is. But I am a British nationalist because, I feel British, I feel Welsh too, but I feel British also, and I want us to be a self-governing nation. I can't understand how anybody, whatever their political philosophy, doesn't want to be the same. Why would you want to be governed by somebody else?
And it's the practical reality of it. You can't affect their decisions, or at least when you we actually have managed to kind of recently with the Article 13, but it's been a real struggle, and it's taken tens of thousands of people to really sit up and take notice. There isn't like the sort of low level at the ballot box work that you would normally do. It's like I say, it's about accountability, and they're just not accountable. And Juncker acts like he's not accountable. He says some of the most outrageous things, like things like, I'm for secret backroom dealings, I don't mind ignoring democracy. He openly says these things. It's like, okay, well, that's a man who's not accountable to anyone. That's a man that you can't remove if you want to. It's absolutely baffling. But Neil, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.